大家好, I'm Nathan Rich, aka 火锅大王. It's important to understand what drives the anti-Chinese crowd. It's simple to write them off as just phonies doing it for the money or whatever. But there is an actual deranged pro-war mindset out there that I like to examine occasionally. It helps to remind me of the rabid anti-human thought patterns I'm so much against. It's the mindset of fascism, enforced inequality, interventionism, and so on. I recently created another YouTube channel for live streams, which has a pretty blank history on it, and so now I get the default search results when I use YouTube. I simply typed in China and found a very bizarre fascist video being promoted. It's by an African English teacher who used to live in China some years ago. China is preparing its citizens for war. You should not ignore this, is the title of this video. And the thumbnail is a picture of Chinese people protesting against war. They're protesting against Japanese disputes made more passionate because of the Japanese invasion of China. And there's this guy who was one of those people who came to China, taught English, but told Chinese people he was something much more. In his case, a doctor trainer, which no doubt got him lots of special treatment by people who actually believed him. In reality, of course, he was training them by teaching them English words like mop and broom. Then he conquered China by driving around on a motorcycle and has since gone into the fringe far right as deeply as possible. But we don't need any of this background to appreciate his video. We don't need to point out the far-right sites that love his content, nor his strange love of anti-race mixing cults, or any of that stuff. We can simply listen to his video to gain a greater understanding of the white power mindset. Let's see what he has to say.
I've got something you're really going to want to see here because it concerns you.
This background is a green screen, he's not in China, and all of his info is from abroad. So here's the first part of the fascist mindset. It's already begun. Non-extremists will always wonder why their country should be waging war in other countries. And the key is that they need to be convinced that somehow those events affect them personally. It's very difficult to promote distant wars without people feeling close to the issue. We see this trend in many videos. Often the first thing they need to get out of the way is why whatever violence that they're promoting needs to be done. Because the situation is already affecting you personally.
Why is the Western world so damn stupid when it comes to dealing with China? Why is it that we allow them to get away with what they get away with?
And already we move on to the next trick. What he's doing here is called gaslighting. People with low IQs fall for this quite easily. He knows very well that the Western media is overwhelmingly anti-Chinese, and that it's the worst it's been since the 1950s. That's trivial to confirm. He knows that, but he needs to convince you of the opposite, otherwise China would be placed in a victim position. What he desperately wants to do is place them in the aggressor position. He's smart enough to know there is a concern among people against victimization. So, he tries to stamp out the resistance immediately.
Australia has now signed a deal. They're going to be getting nuclear submarines because they need nuclear submarines because of the threat from China in the region, let's be honest.
So here, without qualification, what he's doing is asserting that China is a threat to Australia because he knows the right wing down there feels this way. Of course, there's absolutely no historical grounds for this claim, and there's nothing to indicate that's the case today, but he plays into the fears he knows exist. This is a very, very normal way to talk to low IQ people, or people who do have higher IQs but are thinking emotionally. Here's his reasons for why China is a threat to Australia.
China's been ramping up this massive navy, they're building these false islands, they're doing all this kind of stuff.
Proportionately, China needs many more warships to be on equal coverage as the US. That's something neoconservatives can never discuss. In defense of America, things flop around between absolute numbers and proportion to fit the narrative. And in attacking China, they are reversed. America has one ship for every 780,000 citizens, while China has one ship for every 1.8 million of its citizens. It has the most Navy ships in the world because it has the most people to protect. And false islands have nothing to do with Australia, or at least he hasn't pointed out any way that they do. But he'll just move on. You needn't think much about his points because they don't make much sense. They aren't meant for you to think about, only to feel.
They've been very aggressive towards Australia as far as trade policies are concerned.
This is an extremely common and surprisingly effective tactic that stupid people accept without a single thought. There is no such thing as aggressive trade policies. You don't have to trade with China. If you don't want to trade with China, don't. No matter how good or bad the deal is, your country has the choice to do what it wants to do. This is the same line of thought that led to the Opium Wars, the extremely far-right concept of forcing trade terms on other countries because their systems and people are deemed inferior. This is one of the reasons capitalism can slip into certain branches of fascism, because unchecked profit chasing leads to enforced inequality.
I'm sure you've seen the clip of Victor Gao.
Australia itself will be a target for possible nuclear attacks in the future.
Can I just stop you there? Can I just stop you there, Victor? Australia will be a target for nuclear attack from whom?
You do not need to know whom it will be, but as a logic, no one wants to target any nuclear-free zone, which now includes Australia.
Australia has said it will not be carrying nuclear weapons. These are nuclear-powered submarines, as indeed China has. But we're not talking about nuclear weapons. So how is it a target?
Do you really believe you can trust what Washington or even what London say? If Australia is armed with nuclear submarines, Australia will lose that privilege of not being targeted with nuclear weapons by other countries, and that should be the wake-up call for the Australians.
So this guy is saying that Australia stepping up to using nuclear power subs is going to put them on the world stage as nuclear capable. Nuclear subs can absolutely be fitted for nuclear weapons. So what he's saying is Australia is raising its profile into the realm of potential nuclear targets by taking this step. He's not threatening Australia, he's appealing to pacifists in Australia by pointing out this is a big military step. Notice also that the anti-Chinese commentator here left out this revealing clip because it diffuses the scare.
What I say today is not a threat. It's as simple as logic. You do one thing in geopolitics, it will lead to the next logical step. And the next logical step is Australia will lose the privilege of not being targeted with nuclear warheads once they operate nuclear submarines.
If you actually listen to what he's saying instead of clipping him out of context, he's pretty clear. This isn't a threat. He's discussing the geopolitical implications of joining the nuclearized combat category. This is removed because the fascists will always try to paint the other side as aggressive, belligerent instigators, to be used later as rationale for the instigation of belligerent aggression.
Surely that's unacceptable for someone representing China to say something like that?
Ask yourself, why would that be unacceptable? He's not talking about China, he's talking about Australia and pointing out they are increasing their risk. He even specifically mentions multiple countries and points out that Australia is bound to fight in wars alongside America. China has nukes, and as a consequence of that, it is a potential nuclear target. Generally, the feeling today is that we shouldn't be nuking countries which don't have nukes themselves. And what he's saying is, this is a big step towards taking that risk. Note the doubling down on the lie. As the fascist saying goes, the bigger the lie, the more people will believe it. This is why doubling down is so important. Reinforcement blockades simple minds from contrarian thought.
Why is it that we always let China get away with this kind of stuff and we just stand back and say, oh, it's just China, we better be careful?
So this is just more gaslighting, of course. No one lets China get away with this. It's a reasonable thing to point out and is the softest imaginable way to point out this fact to Australians. And the media surrounding this whole thing is constant 24/7 anti-China rubbish. There's hardly a soft voice in the West on this issue anymore. So we can see the narrative of this video slowly coming together.
Here in the West, we have this big debate all the time about how we should talk about certain things. We don't want to talk about China in an aggressive way. We don't want to treat them as an enemy or a threat. We don't want to put those words out there because we're concerned that it might hurt the feelings of China.
Just more gaslighting. He knows very well that channels like him, which are promoted by YouTube, and most of the mainstream Western media constantly portray China as a threat. The reason he doesn't want to admit this is because it makes people feel that there's already enough energy into hating China. He doesn't want that. As we'll discover later in this video, he wants more energy into hating China. That's what his channel's for, and that is specifically what this video calls for. And did you see how frustrated he is that people won't speak even more negatively about China? Isn't that interesting? Then he provides us some evidence on how soft the world is on China.
We have to make sure that we conduct a debate in a way that doesn't arouse fear and anger and anxiety amongst the Australian people.
This is us. This is the Western developed world, the democracies of the world. This is us, the way we deal with people diplomatically. This is us being nice. This is us saying we have to be careful.
Yes, this is how rational people speak. This is how people who don't want war and conflict speak. Here, he appeals to the sense of injustice. He wants you to feel that this one person, taken out of context, who isn't saying what you think he's saying, represents the general attitude of the West. And he wants you to feel that attitude is unfounded, weak, and unjust. But of course, it's just another lie.
If we talk about protecting ourselves from a potential invasion by China or protecting Taiwan from a potential invasion from China, it's seen as warmongering or fear-mongering, and it's controversial for some reason to even mention these things.
Here's where I point out quite simply what 99% of his followers must have missed.
Concerned that it might hurt the feelings of China.
The clip he showed was a person not wanting to cause problems in Australia. Here, listen to it again.
In a way that doesn't arouse fear and anger and anxiety amongst the Australian people.
The Australian people, he said. And with SerpentZA's comments on this, we really start to see the naked fascism. Yes, why oh why is warmongering controversial? He wants warmongering. And in case you are wondering, warmongering is controversial because calling for fear and war is exactly the type of thing that causes fear and war. It's controversial because these people aren't fascists. They don't want to enforce inequality on the world stage. They want peace.
In mainland China, they are blustering and constantly calling for war, constantly talking about how they're going to invade Taiwan, constantly talking about how America and the West is their enemy. While you're worried about your words being misconstrued as perhaps a little bit too aggressive or perhaps something that might escalate a situation or something, China already is full blast escalating, speaking aggressively, and they're doing it to every single citizen of China.
China is calling for war and speaking aggressively to every single citizen of China. That's what he just said. And as we move through this video, we'll discover that his yellow peril claim is literally based on nothing but his own projection. And in true gaslighting form, it's difficult to determine if he actually believes the evidence he will present shows what he claims it does, or if he's smart enough to know he's simply lying to his followers.
So everyone's familiar with news pop-ups, right? You're using a phone and a notification will come up if you're subscribed to different news services.
This is the level of intelligence we're dealing with, by the way. He needs to explain what notifications are to his viewers.
You know what pops up on your phone in China?
News? I'm guessing that a news app pops up news notifications?
You know what pops up on your phone in China? Articles about attacking the West and how bad America is or how bad the West is and how much of an enemy they are. That's what.
Look at that fake pause there. I love it. Guys, you aren't going to believe what pops up in the news in China. Messages telling you to attack America. And here's an example. It's a news pop-up saying America plans to develop B-21 bombers to counter China and Russia. Jesus, China, where did you get that crazy idea from? I mean, I'm an American, so I can find the real news. My news pop-ups would have totally different information. Like, for example, this article about how experts believe the B-21 is part of efforts to counter China and Russia. Or, sorry, I guess I should do a long emotional pause. You know what pops up on your phone in America? Articles about attacking China and how bad China is and how much of an enemy they are. That's what. Did you believe it? Great! You see, people, the issue isn't the militarization. It's not the expansion of war capabilities. The issue isn't the news article. The issue is Chinese people are being told about this in news headlines, exactly how we are in the West. And that's not acceptable. We cannot treat Chinese people how we treat ourselves. They must be treated with inequality. Starting to understand how this works? There's no explanation given as to why Chinese people don't deserve to know these things, because his audience already knows what's wrong with Chinese people. And the next proof of China telling all of its citizens to attack America is also reported here in this Reuters article. Telling, isn't it? He goes very far to turn news articles that are in both China and the West into China pushing for war against the West. U.S. Army uses a bomb to kill civilians in Afghanistan. They take revenge after the airport bombing. Yep, here in the Daily Beast and all over the place. People in the West have notifications of this information on their phones too. And another one saying that these jets will be in Japan. They will be. This is reported in the West. These aren't hateful war messages. This is just literally the news. Notice also, he isn't concerned in the slightest about these actual acts of provocation on the other side of the world from the US. That's not the problem to him. The problem is that they are reported to Chinese people. This one's about food shortages with Afghanistan refugees, as reported here and acknowledged by the Pentagon. Nothing to do with starting a war with anyone. This one's about Australia discussing reducing its dependence on China, which is widely reported in the West. Notice here also the other notifications are blanked out. Could some of those be positive about the West? Neutral? Unrelated to the West? Just random news stories? We don't know. It doesn't fit the propaganda. This one is something about the relations between China and America, and so far, literally 0 of these have supported his claim that these messages are to attack the West or hate the West or America. And if you're wondering what he's blabbering about this whole time, first, I want you to know that before Winston Fuentes here was telling people he was a doctor trainer, he told Chinese people he was an IT professional. What he's talking about here is that he doesn't understand technology and he thinks that the government is forcing people to read news articles.
Are pretty appalling, the things that are being broadcast around and popping up on people's phones all around China.
Of course, a simple search on the internet would have revealed the much more boring truth. See that little logo there? That's the Oppo browser logo. See this Reddit page? This is people talking about how Oppo phones have news notifications on by default. That's right, the actual big bad evil conspiracy here is that one phone company is by default showing news headlines about the same thing reported in the West. All news, by the way, not just geopolitical news. But again, celebrity news doesn't fit the narrative, so it's removed entirely. China must be made to be seen as aggressive and as dangerous and as different from us as possible. That is how you justify an attack. You disguise it as a defense. This one's about an ongoing island dispute with Japan, reporting on a small incident. Still nothing about attacking America or Australia or the West, but it doesn't matter. His videos are not for Chinese people who can actually read this stuff. That's why he doesn't use subtitles. His videos are for stupid people who want to find more reasons to go to war and to hate Asians. This one is about evidence that the US has coronaviruses and strongly suggests it started there. That hasn't been disproven, and maybe you could consider it fake news, sure. Fake news like the endless streams of people claiming definitively that it came from China against all current evidence, like the closest relative to the virus not being from China. And notice here a few interesting things. This is a very important thing to note. He's suggesting that these are notifications calling for war against America. And this one he's showing is one saying the coronavirus came from America. This seems to indicate he views claims of coronavirus origins against the country calling for war. And finally, let it be noted that he and his girlfriend have constantly made claims of coronavirus origins against China. Interesting when you put those thoughts together. America is allowing Chinese vaccine. Wow, that's one crazy headline. Here he's just literally putting anything up he can, again, knowing practically no one who can read Chinese is watching his video anyway. He might as well just put up notifications about Cardi B.
It's awful. It's warmongering.
He just a few moments ago didn't understand why warmongering was controversial, remember? But here, when a phone company is warmongering by notifying people of the news by default, suddenly it's awful. Another example of the logical hoops the illogical fascist ideologues jump through to make themselves feel consistent. The core of this message is quite clear. China bad. Except that axiom and these arguments makes sense. It's the exact same thing as in old Germany. Examine their logic about the Jews and it all makes pretty good sense. If you start with the assumption that Jews bad. If you don't start with that assumption, suddenly the whole thing falls apart. This is why anti-Chinese material like his always finds the hateful people. It's because everything he's saying makes relative sense, if you already believe China bad. And if you're slightly unsure of China bad, his channel and others will work hard to convince you of such. If you're convinced, it all makes sense. If, however, you assume that Chinese people are humans and that China deserves the right to its own destiny, then suddenly this logic starts breaking down. And the more you appreciate China and Chinese people and start to understand them and their perspective, the further and further away you move from this kind of hate speech. This is why I don't normally watch his videos. It's not because I can't stand his refusal to do research or his lazy, tired hatefulness. It's not even because he lived in China for a few years and somehow still didn't understand a single thing happening around him. The real reason I don't watch his videos is that I live under the assumption that people in the world are all people. They are, by and large, guided by their views on the right actions to take. In short, I believe as the default that people should be granted the assumption of equality. I don't believe in the assumption of inequality, not because it's a core component of fascism, but because I think it's actually incorrect. But without that core assumption of inequality, videos like these are meaningless drivel.
It's aggressive, it's anti-foreign, it's xenophobic, it's racist.
Nothing he's shown us so far has been racist or anything else he just said. It's just literally the same kind of stuff I see in the West. Surely even his followers can notice that by now? Or perhaps they can explain why reporting on fighter jets is racist?
Imagine your average everyday grandpa sitting down there drinking his tea, doing his thing, and something pops up on his phone saying how bad America is and how aggressive they are towards China and how we have to prepare to fight against them.
Here he tries to personalize things in a very one-sided way. This is just as easy to debunk as anything else. Imagine this, an average everyday white American grandpa sitting there drinking his coffee, doing his thing, and something pops up on his phone saying how bad China is and how aggressive they are towards Australia and how we should prepare to fight them. You know, like a video by an anti-Chinese English teacher. This is what's happening. Strange how it doesn't seem as scary when the person's white, right? Why is that? Are white people somehow better? It's never explained, it's just implied.
China is preparing its populace for a war, and if not a war, preparing its populace to shun the rest of the world, block everything out, and be completely China-centric.
Again, nothing he said here supports any of his claims. All of these were just news articles.
Everybody in mainland China is being pushed to their phones.
Here he said it again. Everybody in mainland China is getting these pushed to their phones.
This one's just mocking America's withdrawal from Afghanistan.
It's not mocking anything. He's just added that. It's just saying that there's nothing else the US can do in Afghanistan. He's representing it as poorly as possible, and yet all he can come up with is it's mockery. It's not a call for war. And notice that there's no commentary on the ongoing Muslim genocide perpetrated by his neocon friends. Nothing. No justice for the Muslims who are airstriked or killed. No commentary on the occupation of other countries by Western forces. The only bad thing here is that some Chinese people have read a news article about how America has lost its power in Afghanistan. That's the issue we need to talk about because that's the only angle which can be spun to work against China.
America is going to export B-21 bombers to fight against China and Russia?
That's a question mark. Certainly even his viewers know what that means, right? Well, don't be so sure. Often these types of videos try to hook you early, then later the evidence becomes weaker and weaker. As weak minds fatigue, thoughts like, wait, that's a question mark, become harder and harder to reach. Then he just goes on and on through a bunch of news articles, and I know I keep saying this, but literally zero of them are pushing anyone to go to war.
Imagine you were getting things pushed to your phone, except the exact same thing, except they were painting China as the enemy.
We don't need to imagine anything. That's today, right now. He's describing the West as it exists today. Anyone with news notifications are bombarded with anti-China news articles.
Would there not be certain groups of people who would be offended by that?
Yes, there would be people like me pushing back on it. That's what I'm doing. I'm pushing back against sources of hate against China, of which he is one. And this pushback is exactly what he's fighting against. It's gaslighting again.
Why are we always tiptoeing around, worried about hurting the feelings of China?
More gaslighting, just reinforcing the same thing. We are so fair and balanced about China, one of the weakest claims I've ever heard. and one that, by the way, he had to lie about to even come up with one example of.
They openly discriminate and show hatred towards the outside world.
The evidence he uses here as hatred towards the outside world are Global Times political cartoons which suggest Fort Detrick as the source of the coronavirus. We know they leaked something in the summer of 2019 that's publicly reported in the United States. So what was it? You're not allowed to know. And literally none of these cartoons have anything to do with hatred.
Everyone is afraid of coming across as too aggressive and that they may start some sort of conflict. Yet China doesn't care about speaking aggressively and actively encourages its news outlets and citizens to prepare for war and to propagate hatred, distrust, and malice towards America, the rest of the world, and to prepare for war. Should we not maybe be doing the same?
Here we arrive at the apparent true purpose of his video. He's presented zero evidence of his claims, and now we get to the solution to this thing he hasn't shown as a problem. The solution is we should express hate towards China. That's what this video is about. Chinese people are inferior for reasons not explained. We are too nice to them, and we should hate them more.
I don't want to be a warmonger or a fearmonger or anything like that, but if my neighbor is constantly talking about how he's going to attack me and how bad I am and how they're going to defeat me in a single blow and all this kind of crap, surely I should be preparing in the same fashion, at least preparing a good defense, preparing myself when this belligerent, terrible neighbor of mine decides he's going to strike? Or should I just be tiptoeing around saying, oh, I've got this crazy neighbor and I really shouldn't even mention his name. I should avoid coming home when he's home because I don't want to make him angry.
Here he fails again at a personalization effort. If your neighbor is threatening you, you should be well prepared, and you should not try to engage or provoke. This is just common sense. But again, fatigued, weaker minds will have already given up resistance.
We are allowing China to bluster and prepare for war and build up its military and its navy.
Its navy is tiny compared to what it should be at if it wants equivalent representation. This is data mangling to build a narrative. The exact same data could or perhaps should be used to highlight the extremely large navy size of the United States or even Russia. But again, those aren't in line with the "we need to hate China more" message, so they're just disregarded.
And take advantage of the rest of the world.
This is a weasel phrase right here. He throws this in without evidence, without any explanation. You're just supposed to accept that China is taking advantage of the whole world. And if your mind is already primed from endless far-right news articles, this concept will just be granted.
We're too kind and too nice. We care about their feelings too much. We're too compassionate towards China.
More and more gaslighting. We're talking about elementary school level of intelligence required to see through these statements. I mean, that's where we're at. Then he's rambling about press freedom in China and repeats this classic fascist talking point.
CCP is not a nice group of people. There's nothing positive about them. A lot positive about the Chinese people, mind, but not the Chinese government.
I've already debunked this before, but maybe I'll do another video more easy to understand so even his followers can comprehend it.
Now you know what everyone in China is reading on their phones on a daily basis, the kind of crap that's being pushed to them.
He wants you to know just how pervasive this massive threat is. The threat he hasn't shown one single piece of evidence for. So he reiterates that this is everyone in China. Not some people, all of them. He's very clear on that point. All the Chinese people are preparing for war. We should therefore obviously prepare for war against them. Not the government and the people. Everyone in China. He can't pretend to not want to go to war with Chinese people for even the span of one video.
Don't be that person who's like, oh, don't say that. You might be a little too aggressive, that you might hurt their feelings. Because they don't care about your feelings. They don't care about our feelings. You've seen it for yourself.
So here are the main takeaways from this video as I see it. A phone company has news notifications on by default. Some of those news articles talk about controversial issues and generally side with China on those issues. Though the same news articles are available in the West, and Westerners also have news app notifications, this entire thing is bad because it has to do with China. There's something about China specifically which makes them reading the news a bad thing. Because none of these news articles said anything at all about attacking America or going to war, that proves that China's preparing for war and going to attack America and Australia. Because some political cartoons are edgy, that means we should not be content only producing more anti-Chinese content than any other region in the world. In fact, we should stop feeling bad about anti-Chinese rhetoric altogether and increase it markedly. When a news company in China says anything which could even be remotely viewed as fear-mongering or warmongering, that is awful. And that's why we should spread fear-mongering and warmongering, which thankfully we have him for. If you're looking for further reasons to hate Chinese people, he's definitely your guy. I'm not going to convince you of anything because, again, you're starting from a perspective that can and does only end in one place, the natural conclusion. And that conclusion is what we today call fascism. So I hope this video helps some people out there understand the mechanism of modern fascism and how people like him use it to push for war against Chinese people while slithering behind a curtain so he can pretend to care about those very same people the whole time. To me, it's a very easy debunk as it's founded in hatred, which is, after all, merely a projection of the frustrations one has against oneself. It's not a logically consistent position, and therefore it's barely worthy of notice beyond real-world consequences. To those of his fans who have come to my channel to get schooled in something other than English, I probably didn't change your mind a bit, and that's okay. I don't care if you don't like Chinese people, I really, really don't. But I'm glad you watched this video, because now when you make your hate comments in defense of fascism, you'll have no excuse, as I have clearly broken down for you exactly the lies and deception you willingly support. You have no one but yourself to blame for your outcomes. It's not China's fault that you're stupid, it's your fault. I'm Nathan Rich, a guy with the most radical idea in the entire world. Let's try to treat other countries fairly. I know, it's quite controversial. Until next time, thanks everybody. 谢谢.